Medieval plague doctor. The horrifying truth behind the bird mask. You wake to 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate. The kind that don't ask, they announce. It's not your neighbor. It's not family. It's the knock that means someone has noticed. The smell seeping under your door like a confession you can't take back. The silence where your child's breathing used to be. You move to the window, and there, standing in the street like a monument to something you don't have words for, is a figure. Leather coat gleaming like beetle wings under moonlight. And the face. God, the face. A mask, curved and long, stretching forward like a beak. Like death itself learned to walk upright and wear clothes. This is not a doctor. Not anymore. This is something else. Something that wears the skin of medicine but moves with the certainty of an executioner. You feel it in your chest, the weight of being seen, of being marked. The door is between you and it, but the door means nothing now. It raises one gloved hand. The knock comes again. And you understand. The nightmare has already begun. But let's pull back from the fever, from the nightmare. Let's see it for what it really was. These weren't healers. They were municipal employees. Hired by cities so desperate they'd pay anyone willing to walk among the dying. Because the real doctors, the ones with reputations, with families, with futures, they ran. They fled to country estates and locked their gates and pretended the screaming in the streets was just the wind. The men who stayed behind the beak? They were the ones with nothing left to lose. Young, inexperienced, failures in their own profession. Medical students who couldn't finish. Surgeons who'd killed more patients than they'd saved. Men whose names had already been forgotten before the plague even arrived. And the cities paid them. Handsomely. Because desperation has no budget. They paid them to walk streets slick with waste and blood, to enter homes where entire families had been dead for days, to count bodies, to mark doors, to write names in ledgers that would outlive everyone in them. These men knew the math, knew that most plague doctors didn't survive their first month. They signed the contract anyway. What kind of man does that? What kind of person looks at certain death and says, yes, I'll wear your uniform. I'll become your symbol. And the uniform, God, the uniform, that's where the horror truly begins. Let me describe it for you. Every piece, every layer of the monster they built. The coat, long, waxed, black as a void. It gleamed like the shell of something dead and preserved. Heavy enough to drag with every step, announcing arrival before the figure even appeared. The hat, wide-brimmed, casting shadow over shadow. You could see them from blocks away. Silent, dark shapes moving through fog like pieces of the city's own nightmare made solid. The gloves, leather, thick. They never touched living skin. Every gesture looked like accusation. And then, the mask. That terrible bird face. Glass eyes that reflected nothing human back at you. Just light. Just emptiness. The beak stretched forward, long and curved, hollow inside. They stuffed it with dried flowers, herbs, cloves, camphor, rose petals crushed into dust. A desperate pharmacy crammed into a leather skull, filtering air they believed was poison itself. But here's what they won't tell you in the history books. The mask wasn't just protection. It was dehumanization. The moment a man strapped that beak to his face, he stopped being a man. He became something else. Neither doctor nor human. A creature. A symbol. Death wearing clothes and carrying a cane. And inside that mask, in the darkness behind the glass, what happens to the person trapped in there? Behind the beak, something happens. Identity dissolves. You cannot see his face, cannot read his eyes through the glass, cannot tell if he's young or old, afraid or indifferent, disgusted or numb. He becomes anonymous, a symbol, not a person anymore, just an idea of death walking upright. But erasure works both ways. The mask doesn't just hide him from you. It hides you from him. He doesn't have to see you as human. Doesn't have to meet your eyes when you beg. Doesn't have to feel the weight of your child's name when he writes it in his ledger. Behind the beak, you're not a mother, not a father, not someone's daughter dying alone in the dark. You're just a body, a statistic, a problem to document and move on from. And that's the genius of it, isn't it? The mask protects him, not from disease, but from guilt. He can do terrible things behind that leather face and never have to own them. Never have to carry the memory of your expression. Never have to remember that you were a person who once had a name. Foucault wrote about power as performance, about how uniforms and symbols turn men into instruments of authority. But what happens when the uniform is a monster? When power hides behind a beak and calls itself medicine? Let me tell you what these masked figures actually did. His job wasn't to heal, it was to count. He moved house to house, carrying a ledger bound in leather that smelled like tannin and old blood. At each door, he painted a red cross. Slow, deliberate. The sign that said, condemned. The sign that meant no one would help you. No one would come. You were marked now, separated, left to rot behind your own walls. Inside, he counted bodies. Living, dead, dying. It didn't matter, they all went in the ledger. Names recorded like inventory. Addresses, symptoms, dates. Mass grave receipts written in careful script. He examined the dying, searching for buboes, those black, swollen lymph nodes that bloomed like grotesque flowers under the skin. Neck, armpits, groin. When he found them, sometimes he lanced them, pressed the blade in and released rivers of pus and blood that stank like meat left in summer heat. Sometimes he just watched, made notes, moved on. This wasn't medicine. This was management. Death at scale, reduced to administrative tasks. Human tragedy converted into data points. Suffering transformed into check marks on a page. And when the documentation was done, when the crosses were painted and the names were written, then came the treatments, the real nightmares, the things they did behind closed doors when no one was watching. The treatments. God, the treatments. They bled you first, opened your veins and let the blood pour into bowls until you fainted, until your lips turned white, until you were too weak to scream. They believed bad blood carried the poison, that emptying you out might save what was left. When bleeding failed, they brought fire. Red-hot irons pressed against the buboes, cauterizing the swollen flesh. The smell, burned skin, fat, infection, filled the room like an offering to some cruel god. You could hear the hiss, feel the smoke. They forced you to drink mercury, arsenic, crushed emeralds mixed with wine, because wealth must cure something, mustn't it? They covered you in entrails. Freshly killed pigeons, sliced open, still warm, strapped to your chest. The theory: birds would draw out the disease. The reality? You lay there, covered in death, waiting to join it. Some doctors prescribed sitting in sewers, breathing the fumes, covering yourself in excrement, because surely poison fights poison. Others cut live toads in half and tied them to the swellings, believing the animal's agony would absorb yours. These weren't fringe practices. These were official medical protocols. Recommended, documented, performed by men who called themselves healers. The plague killed you slowly, but the cure tortured you first. Behind the mask, the doctor administered suffering and called it salvation. Did they know? Did they know it was all for nothing? Here's the truth that makes it all unbearable. They didn't know. Germ theory wouldn't exist for another 200 years. Bacteria were invisible. Viruses were unimaginable. They had no microscopes, no labs, no science that could see what was actually killing everyone. They believed in miasma, poisoned air, evil vapors rising from swamps and corpses, divine punishment made manifest, cosmic imbalance that needed correcting through blood and fire and ritual. Every treatment was a desperate guess, wrapped in the authority of ancient texts written by men who knew even less. But here's what breaks you when you really sit with it. They believed they were helping. Behind that bird mask, the plague doctor truly thought his tortures were mercy. When he pressed the hot iron to your flesh, he believed he was saving you. When he bled you until you couldn't stand, he thought he was purging poison. When he made you drink arsenic, he was following the wisdom of centuries. He acted with absolute conviction, in absolute ignorance. That's the philosophical gut punch, the tragedy underneath the horror. He wasn't a monster. He was a man doing his best in a world that had no answers. A man convinced his cruelty was compassion. And that conviction, that terrible, misguided certainty, it hollowed him out from the inside. Something broke inside them. You can't watch thousands die under your hands and stay whole. Can't administer suffering every day. Can't lance flesh and hear screaming and smell rot for months on end without something fundamental cracking deep in your core. Some became numb, mechanical, moving through plague houses like automatons, performing rituals without feeling. The screams became background noise. The dying became objects. They stopped seeing faces, just symptoms, just work to be done and documented. Others became cruel. They experimented on the dying because they'd die anyway. Tried different poisons, different cuts, different tortures disguised as treatments, just to see what would happen. Just to feel something, even if that something was the power of playing God in hell. Some turned to drink, others to religious mania, speaking in tongues, claiming visions, seeing demons in every shadow. Historical records mention doctors who laughed while working, who sang songs over corpses, who developed twitches, uncontrollable shaking, facial tics, compulsions they couldn't name. The mask protected them from disease, but it couldn't protect them from what they witnessed, what they did, what they became. The bird beak hid their faces, but it couldn't hide them from themselves. And for some, the worst ones, the mask became an opportunity, a way to profit from the apocalypse. Death became a business. The cities made deals with their plague doctors. You risk your life, you keep what you find. Clothes stripped from corpses, furniture from abandoned homes, jewelry pried from cold fingers, valuables that no one was left alive to claim. For some, this wasn't enough. They marked healthy families as infected, painted the Red Cross on doors where no one was sick, then waited for the occupants to flee or die so they could loot everything inside. They moved through neighborhoods like vultures, the bird mask now a promise of theft disguised as medicine. Others extorted the dying, whispered promises of special treatments, rare herbs, secret remedies. For gold and silver the victims would hand over with shaking, desperate hands. Gold they'd never see again. Gold the doctor himself would likely never spend, because most didn't survive long enough to enjoy their plunder. The mask that once symbolized sacrifice now reeked of opportunism, predatory, parasitic. This is what happens when society collapses, when desperation strips away pretense. The worst of humanity doesn't hide anymore. It wears a costume and walks openly through streets piled with bodies, taking what it wants, justifying everything. The plague doctor became both victim and predator, suffering and profiting, dying and stealing. And the cities they moved through, God, the cities. Imagine the streets they walked. Bodies stacked like firewood at every corner, waiting for carts that came too slowly and never had enough room. Doors marked with red crosses, sometimes 5, 10 houses in a row. Entire families sealed inside to die together. Because quarantine meant abandonment, meant no food, no water, just walls and darkness, and each other's final breaths. The smoke never stopped. Mass cremation pits burned day and night, thick black columns rising into gray skies, the smell of burning flesh mixing with the salt air and rot until you couldn't tell them apart anymore. Market squares stood empty, silent. Places that once roared with life, now haunted only by wind pushing through abandoned stalls. But the screaming, God, the screaming. It came from boarded windows, from locked doors, from people trapped inside their own homes, begging to be let out, to be seen, to matter one more time before the end. And through this apocalyptic landscape walked the plague doctor, the only figure still moving, still working. The bird mask bobbing through fog and smoke like a dark buoy in an ocean of death. His footsteps echoed in streets that used to sing. Now they only whispered. But the people left alive, the ones still breathing behind their windows, how did they respond to living in this hell? When death becomes normal, something in the human mind snaps. People flagellated themselves in the streets, whipped their own backs bloody, believing plague was divine punishment and pain was penance. Processions of the self-mutilated, crawling through mud and waste, begging God for mercy while their flesh opened in ribbons. They burned cats and dogs, thousands of them, slaughtered in bonfires because animals must spread disease, mustn't they? They killed the very predators that hunted the rats, the real carriers, making everything worse while convinced they were helping. They needed someone to blame. Minorities, strangers, anyone other. Anyone who looked different, spoke different, prayed different. Lynch mobs formed in afternoon light. Witch hunts erupted overnight. Neighbors who'd lived side by side for decades suddenly became enemies, accusers, executioners. Some communities descended into hedonism, orgies in empty houses, feasting on looted food. Eat, drink, for tomorrow we die. Philosophy and madness bleeding together until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Others became fanatically religious, others nihilistic, others catatonic. Every possible human response to annihilation playing out simultaneously across dying cities. And through it all moved the plague doctor, witnessing, recording. Neither participant nor judge, just observer in a bird mask, walking between extremes of human collapse. Utterly alone, utterly alienated. No longer part of the world he documented. No one would touch them. Plague doctors lived in complete isolation. Even other medical professionals, surgeons, apothecaries, midwives, crossed the street when they saw the bird mask approaching. Taverns turned them away. Churches refused them entry. Markets went silent when they appeared, merchants covering their goods, customers fleeing like the doctor himself was contagion made flesh. Their families abandoned them. Wives left. Children were sent away. Parents disowned them. Because once you put on that mask, you became something else, something contaminated, cursed, a walking vector of death that couldn't be allowed near anything still living. They lived in plague houses, those buildings marked for demolition, where the infected had already died. Or on city outskirts, in shacks and abandoned structures, quarantined by fear and superstition. The bird mask that made them recognizable as doctors also made them untouchable, essential, needed, necessary, but never wanted, never welcomed, never loved. Some doctors never removed their masks, not even in private. Historical accounts mention men found dead still wearing the beak, as if the leather had fused to their faces, as if the identity beneath had been consumed entirely by the symbol. What's left of a person when connection is impossible? When every human interaction is contamination? When even your reflection looks like death? They didn't have to wait long for the answer. Most plague doctors died of plague. The statistics are horrifying. Up to 80% never survived their first outbreak. The mask didn't save them. The herbs stuffed in the beak, dried flowers, camphor, cloves, they filtered nothing that mattered. The waxed coat didn't prevent infection. The gloves didn't stop death from finding skin. They died like everyone else. Fever that burned from the inside. Buboes blooming black under their arms, in their groins, swelling until skin split. Delirium that made them see things that weren't there, or perhaps finally see things that always were. But here's the cruel poetry of it. They died alone. No one would tend to them. No one would bring water, or hold their hands, or whisper comfort in their final hours. The plague doctor, who spent weeks moving through homes full of the dying, offering what small mercies he could, he received none. He died on a floor somewhere, in a plague house, in a shack on the outskirts, alone with his agony and his regrets and the bird mask still strapped to his face, because even in death he couldn't escape what he'd become. Some were found weeks later, bodies rotting inside the costume, the beak still in place, as if death itself had claimed its uniform back. And you have to ask, looking at all this suffering, all this sacrifice, all this horror, what was it all for? They saved almost no one. The plague ran its course regardless. The treatments didn't work. The bloodletting, the cauterizing, the mercury and arsenic and pigeon entrails. Useless. All of it. The documentation, the quarantines, the red crosses painted on doors. They slowed nothing. The plague would kill 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe before ending on its own, through mechanisms no one understood. Through weather patterns, through rat populations collapsing, through invisible bacterial cycles that wouldn't be discovered for centuries. The plague doctor's sacrifice was, in practical terms, meaningless. He died for nothing, suffered for nothing, became a monster, isolated himself, abandoned his humanity, administered torture in the name of mercy. For nothing. No lives saved, no difference made, just ledgers full of names that no one would remember, and mass graves that would eventually be built over and forgotten. This is the crushing philosophical weight at the center of it all. Martyrdom without effect, suffering without purpose, heroism that accomplishes nothing except its own destruction. Does futility erase meaning? If the outcome is the same whether you act or flee, does the choice to stay matter? If your sacrifice saves no one, was it still sacrifice? Or just another kind of madness? The plague doctors are dead now. All of them. Centuries gone. But the image remains. That bird mask. That terrible symbol. What does it mean to us now? The plague doctor has become an icon. You've seen him. Halloween costume, video game villain, pandemic meme. The bird mask appears on protest signs, street art, horror films, tattoos. We've taken centuries of suffering and turned it into aesthetic, into merchandise, into decoration. But why? Why does this figure, this symbol of medieval horror and medical futility, still haunt our collective imagination? Because the plague doctor embodies something we can't escape. Our fear of disease we can't control. Our distrust of medicine that claims authority it doesn't deserve. Our fascination with death personified, walking upright, wearing a costume that makes it almost beautiful. He's become shorthand for pandemic, for societal collapse, for the moment when civilization's mask slips and we see what's underneath. Rot. Desperation. People dying alone while others profit. He represents the thin line between healer and reaper, between the one who saves you and the one who marks you for death, between mercy and cruelty wearing the same uniform. We can't stop returning to this image, can't stop putting the bird mask on characters, on ourselves, on our fears about what's coming next. The plague is gone, but the symbol remains. And maybe, our fascination with this horror reveals something about us we're not ready to name. Something we recognize in the mirror. We consume tragedy from a distance. You do it too. You watch videos about the Black Death, read articles about medical horrors, stare at images of plague doctors and feel something. Fascination, maybe. A controlled fear. The thrill of knowing it happened to them, not you. That it's history, safely contained in the past where it can't reach you. We turn suffering into content, entertainment, something to scroll through while safe in our beds, our homes, our lives untouched by rot and mass graves. But then 2020 happened, and the distance collapsed. Suddenly we had our own masked figures, our own death counts climbing on screens, our own isolation, our own empty streets, Our own bodies stacked in refrigerated trucks because morgues ran out of room. Our own fear that the knock at the door might be death wearing a uniform. The plague doctor stopped being a medieval curiosity. He became a mirror. And maybe that's why we can't look away. Why the bird mask haunts us now more than ever. Because we lived a version of what it represents. We know what it feels like when society fractures. When experts don't have answers. When the people supposed to save you look like monsters behind their masks. Our fascination with historical horror is just processing our own trauma. Our own fear that it could happen again. That it is happening again. And that next time, the mask might be ours. The plague doctor is dead. All of them. Centuries gone. Bones and dust, and forgotten names in ledgers no one reads. But the role never dies. There will always be plagues, different diseases, different masks, different rituals, but the essence remains the same. Someone must walk into death. Someone must bear witness. Someone must count the bodies, mark the doors, administer what little mercy exists, even knowing it's futile. We learned something from these bird-masked figures, didn't we? The horror of acting with absolute conviction in absolute ignorance. The psychological cost of isolation. The corruption that seeps in when you stand too close to mass death for too long. The crushing weight of martyrdom that accomplishes nothing. Or maybe accomplishes something we can't measure. Something that only matters in the trying. Because here's the thing we can't ignore. The plague doctor knew the statistics, knew most who took the job died within weeks, knew the treatments didn't work, knew he was signing his own death warrant. He put on the mask anyway. Not because he was noble, not because he was heroic, but because someone had to. Because cities were dying and everyone else had run and someone needed to stay and witness the end. That's not nobility. That's something darker, more complex. Courage twisted with desperation, sacrifice blended with futility, mercy that looks like cruelty from certain angles. When the next plague comes, and it will, who will wear the mask? What will it cost them? What will they become when they strap death to their face and walk into streets full of bodies? The bird mask remains, watching from history, empty eyes, hollow beak, waiting.